The notice was no more than a scrap of paper nailed to the wooden board outside the general store. But to Clara, it looked like a lifeline. The edges of the paper were curled from the dry wind that swept down from the hills, and the ink was smudged by dust. But the words were clear enough to read. Cook needed for large cattle ranch. Meals for 12-15 hands. Room and board included. Fair wages. Inquire at Miller's Ranch. Clara stood there longer than most would have, her fingers clutching the thin shawl around her shoulders. It had been nearly 3 months since she had lost everything. Her husband to fever, their tiny cabin to creditors, and her sense of direction to grief. She had wandered from one odd job to another, laundry for travelers, sewing when there was fabric to mend, but none of it lasted. None of it promised the stability she needed. She was tired of moving from porch to porch with no roof of her own, no security to keep the nights from swallowing her whole. The ranch job was daunting. Cooking for so many rough men was no small task. She'd cooked for her late husband, and sometimes for neighbors at gatherings, but 12 or more hungry cowboys. That was another matter. Yet, what other choice did she have? The ad promised room and board, and that was worth more to her than the wages themselves. Shelter, a bed she could call her own, and meals not scavenged from what she could barter, that was salvation. As she stared at the posting, a few townsfolk passed by, giving her curious glances. Everyone in town seemed to know she was a widow, wandering and uncertain. Clara tightened her jaw. Pity was something she despised more than hunger. If she was to survive, it would not be on handouts or sympathy, but on the strength of her own 2 hands. She read the posting again, mouthing the words. Cook needed. She could do that. She had learned to stretch a handful of beans into a meal for 2 days, to coax flavor from little more than salt pork and cornmeal. She knew how to knead dough until it rose high and golden, how to make a pot of stew last until the bones themselves had given every ounce of their richness. She was no stranger to hard work, and in truth, she welcomed it. Work meant purpose, and purpose was something grief had stolen from her. Still, a flicker of doubt stirred. Would the Cowboys accept her? Would they sneer at a woman in their kitchen, or worse, take advantage of her vulnerability? She had heard stories of ranch hands who drank too much and respected too little, but she had also heard of ranchers who treated their workers with fairness, who kept discipline among their men. She could only hope this Miller's Ranch was the latter. The decision pressed down on her as heavily as the sun beating on her back. Clara squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and told herself the truth. She had no better option. It was either take the risk or fade away in quiet desperation. Her late husband's voice seemed to echo in her heart. You're stronger than you think, Clara. You'll find a way. And this, she decided, would be her way. She pulled the notice from the board, ignoring the disapproving look of a woman who had paused nearby. Clutching the paper in her hand, Clara stepped back and read the directions written at the bottom. Inquire at Miller's Ranch, 20 miles west. That meant she would need to find a wagon or walk the distance, but she didn't hesitate. Her satchel, with all she owned in the world, a spare dress, a Bible, and her mother's worn recipe book, was already packed. She was always ready to move on, for she had nowhere else to settle. The dusty main street of the town stretched before her as she turned toward the livery stable. Her pulse quickened. She didn't know what awaited her on that ranch. A kitchen, full of rough laughter, a boss with stern expectations, long days of labor that would leave her exhausted but fed. All of it was possible, and none of it frightened her enough to turn back. For the first time in months, she felt a spark of something like hope. With that scrap of paper pressed to her chest, Clara set her jaw and walked on, unaware that beyond the horizon waited not just a job, but a ranch where her life would entwine with men who would come to rely on her, and with one man in particular whose quiet presence would change everything. The road to Miller's ranch was longer and harsher than Clara expected. Dust clung to her hem and hair, the late summer sun pressing its heat against her shoulders. She had managed to catch a ride on a supply wagon heading halfway west, but the last stretch she walked alone, her satchel heavy against her side. When at last the sprawling ranch came into view, she stopped to catch her breath. It was larger than she had imagined, acres upon acres of open range stretching toward the horizon, dotted with cattle that looked like moving shadows under the evening sky. The main house sat proudly at the center, sturdy and wide, with smoke curling from its chimney. A long bunkhouse stood nearby, alongside stables where the scent of hay and horses carried on the wind. Clara's heart tightened. This was not just a ranch. This was a small kingdom of its own, bustling and alive. As she approached the yard, the sound of laughter and voices spilled out of the bunkhouse. A group of cowboys, dusty from a day's work, lounged against the porch rails, boots crossed, hats tilted low. Their laughter rolled across the yard like thunder, raucous and unrestrained. One of them noticed her first. "Well, I'll be," he drawled, straightening. "Looks like supper just walked in." The others turned their heads. Clara froze for a heartbeat, her pulse quickening. She pulled her shawl tighter, willing herself not to shrink under their eyes. Rough men, tired and hungry, exactly as she had imagined. Yet in their gazes, she saw curiosity more than cruelty. "Don't be fools," another cowboy said, swatting his friend's shoulder. "That must be the new cook Mr. Miller sent word about." They rose to their feet, one by one, and came forward with a kind of unpolished hospitality. "You come for the cooking job, ma'am?" one asked, tipping his hat. I did," Clara answered, her voice softer than she intended. "Well, we're mighty glad of it. Last cook we had burnt beans so bad we figured the coyotes would starve before touching them." The men chuckled, and Clara managed a small, nervous smile. Still, she couldn't shake the sense of being studied. Their eyes lingered, not unkindly, but with the frankness of men who had lived too long without a woman's presence. She stood straighter, determined to show she would not be rattled. And then she noticed him. He was at the edge of the group, half in shadow near the porch post. Unlike the others, he had not laughed or spoken. He watched her quietly, his hat brim low, his expression unreadable. Where the others brimmed with energy, he carried a stillness that drew her attention more than all their noise. His shirt was plain, his boots well worn, and his silence made him seem apart from the rest. Clara felt his gaze steady and sure, but not intrusive. She quickly looked away, unsettled by the intensity of someone who hadn't said a word. The foreman appeared then, wiping his hands on a rag as he stepped from the main house. He was a broad man with gray at his temples and a voice that carried authority. "You must be the widow who answered the posting," he said matter-of-factly. "Name's Harris. I run things here." "Yes, sir," Clara said. "My name's Clara Bennett." Bennett. He nodded, sizing her up with the same practical eye he likely used on livestock and supplies. "You'll have the kitchen. Meals 3 times a day, coffee always on the stove. Men'll bring in what you need from town every week. You'll have a room off the kitchen, small but private. Wages come at the end of each month. That suit you?" "It does." Relief loosened the knot in her chest. "Good. Supper's in 2 hours. Best way to prove yourself is with a meal." The men chuckled, knowingly, some elbowing each other as if this were sport. Clara lifted her chin, letting their amusement roll off her. Cooking was the one skill she trusted without doubt. If food could win their respect, then she would meet the challenge head-on. As Harris walked her toward the kitchen door, Clara glanced, back once more. The cowboys had resumed their banter, though some still watched her with interest. But the quiet man hadn't moved. He remained by the porch post, arms crossed, gaze steady. She told herself not to dwell on it, but something about his silence pressed on her thoughts like a shadow she couldn't name. Inside, The kitchen smelled faintly of grease and burnt coffee, evidence of the men's poor attempts to feed themselves, since the last cook left. Clara set down her satchel and rolled up her sleeves. This was her domain now, and she intended to prove herself. Unaware, she had already made her first impression, and the one who mattered most had yet to say a single word. Clara woke the next morning before dawn, the chill of the prairie air sneaking through the thin walls of her small room off the kitchen. She pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders for a moment, listening. Outside, boots thudded on wooden planks as the first cowboys stirred, preparing for another long day in the saddle. Horses snorted in the barn, and the low bellow of cattle drifted in on the wind. She rose quickly, tying her hair back and slipping on her plain work dress. Today mattered more than any day before. Last night she had prepared a modest supper of biscuits, beans, and fried salt pork to hold the men over, but this morning, her first full meal would truly test her. Cowboys judged a cook not on her politeness or her ability to keep the kitchen tidy, but on whether she could fill their bellies with something worth riding all day on. The kitchen itself was a challenge. A large iron stove dominated one wall, its firebox in need of cleaning, while cupboards held mismatched pans and knives that had seen too much wear. A half-empty barrel of flour leaned in the corner, and the sugar sack was tied tight with twine to keep mice at bay. She ran her hand across the table, rough and scarred from years of chopping. It wasn't much, but she had worked with less before. Clara set to work. She stoked the stove, coaxing flames from the coals until the room warmed. Soon, the air filled with the sharp hiss of bacon fat hitting a hot pan. She cracked eggs one after another, whisking them with a touch of cream left in a crock. Biscuits followed, flour sifted, lard cut in, dough folded and pressed before she slid them into the oven. As the kitchen came alive with the rhythm of her hands, Clara felt steadier, more like herself. Cooking was where her grief loosened its grip, where she could lose herself in creation instead of loss. By the time the first boots clattered into the dining area, the long table was covered with steaming platters, scrambled eggs bright yellow, and soft, bacon crisped at the edges, fried potatoes seasoned with pepper, and biscuits split open, ready for butter and jam. A pot of fresh coffee sent its aroma curling through the air. The cowboys filed in, voices booming with hunger. They fell into their seats like boys at a harvest feast, their faces skeptical until plates were filled and forks clattered. Then came silence, the kind of silence that told her she had either failed completely or exceeded every expectation. Clara stood by the stove, twisting her hands in her apron, waiting. "By thunder," one of them finally muttered, mouth full of biscuit. "This is better than my mama ever made." Laughter erupted, followed by the scrape of chairs as men reached, eagerly for seconds. The mood brightened, and soon the room was buzzing with conversation, stories from the trail, and the rhythmic pounding of boots under the table. Clara allowed herself the smallest smile. She had passed the first hurdle. Not all eyes were light-hearted, though. Across the room, she caught sight of the quiet cowboy again, the one who had stood apart the night before. He sat at the end of the table, eating with measured movements. Unlike the others, he didn't heap his plate greedily or shout over the noise. He ate steadily, silently, his gaze fixed on his food. Still, Clara noticed that he cleaned his plate thoroughly, every crumb gone by the time he pushed it back. He hadn't spoken a word, not even in praise, but his empty plate told her enough. When the last cup of coffee had been drained, Harris, the foreman, leaned back in his chair and stretched. "Well, men, looks like we've got ourselves a cook worth keeping this time. Clara, you've done good." The cowboys raised their mugs in a half-cheer, and Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks. Respect was not easily earned in places like this, but a good meal had won her a place at the table, even if she wasn't sitting there herself. As the men filtered out, buckling their gun belts and pulling on gloves, Clara returned to the kitchen. There would be dishes to scrub, pots to scour, and preparations for the noon meal. Her shoulders ached already, but she felt lighter than she had in months. She belonged here, at least for now. Still, as she rinsed a skillet, her thoughts returned to the quiet cowboy. Why had he not spoken like the others? Why did his silence carry more weight than all their laughter? She shook her head, trying to push it away. It didn't matter who he was or what he thought. She was here to work, not to worry about the mysterious stillness of a stranger. Yet somewhere deep inside, Clara knew that the quiet man's silence would not let her go so easily. Clara quickly discovered that life on a cattle ranch was measured in rhythm. The sun dictated the hours, the cattle dictated the men, and the kitchen dictated her. Each morning began before dawn, when she rose in the dim gray light to stir the fire back to life and set the coffee to boil. By the time the men came in from the barns, shaking off sleep and reaching for mugs, the smell of frying bacon and fresh biscuits would already greet them. At first, the pace nearly overwhelmed her. Breakfast for 15 hungry men meant piles of food, dozens of eggs cracked and whipped, mountains of potatoes diced, and pans of biscuits pulled from the oven. After the men filed out, leaving the table bare, there were dishes stacked shoulder high, pans blackened with grease, and counters needing scrubbing. And just as she finished one round of work, it was already time to prepare for the next meal. But gradually, Clara found her rhythm too. She began to anticipate how much food was needed, which Cowboy liked an extra spoonful of jam, who always reached for the pepper, and who drank his coffee black and quick before rushing out the door. Their quirks amused her more than they annoyed her, and before long she realized that the kitchen, once daunting, had become her place of belonging. The Cowboys themselves were rough around the edges, yet surprisingly kind in their own way. Some of them teased her at first, light-hearted jests about whether she could really keep up with the endless appetites of ranch hands. But once her cooking proved itself, the teasing softened into a sort of protective fondness. They began calling her Miss Clara and made a point of bringing her little things from town: a new jar of molasses, a tin of pepper, once even a bolt of fabric. It was, in many ways, like tending to a family. A loud, rowdy, half-wild family, but a family nonetheless. Their laughter filled the kitchen and dining room during supper, their voices booming as they swapped stories of trail rides, broken saddles, and wild broncs. Sometimes they asked her about her own life, but Clara learned to deflect with simple answers. Her widowhood was a wound she carried quietly, and though she sensed their curiosity, none of them pressed her too hard. All except one, the man who said the least of all. The quiet cowboy was always there, but never in the middle of things. He sat at the far end of the table, arriving late and leaving early. He ate steadily, never wasting food, but rarely asked for seconds. When the others joked or told tall tales, he smiled faintly but seldom joined in. Clara noticed that while the others clattered their plates and spilled crumbs, his place was always left neat, as though he respected not just the food, but the one who had made it. At first, his silence unsettled her. She had grown used to chatter and noise, to the rough cheer of men who worked hard and played hard. But his stillness was different. It was weighty, like an unsolved question. Sometimes she caught him watching her, not in the careless way of men admiring a woman, but with a steady, unreadable expression. Whenever their eyes met, she looked away quickly, embarrassed by the heat that rose to her cheeks. She told herself it was foolish to notice. He was just one of many cowboys. Quiet, yes, but no more important than the rest. And yet, when she lay awake in her small room at night, she often found her thoughts wandering back to that silent figure at the end of the table. The foreman, Harris, treated her fairly. He made sure the men respected her space, and she was grateful for it. Once, when one cowboy grew too bold with a joke, Harris cut him off with a sharp look, and the matter was settled. Clara felt safe enough, though she was careful to guard her dignity. She carried herself with calm purpose, not allowing familiarity to slip too far. Still, the days grew warmer with routine, and her heart began to ease. The grief she had carried when she arrived, raw and heavy, began to soften under the steady work of her hands and the strange comfort of ranch life. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt herself laughing again, even if only quietly at the men's foolishness. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the horizon and painted the land in long shadows, Clara stood outside the kitchen door, apron in her hands, watching the cowboys return from the range. Horses trotted into the corral, dust rising around them. She saw them laughing, slapping each other's backs, already hungry for supper. And there, riding a little apart, was the quiet cowboy. He dismounted smoothly, patted his horse's neck, and walked toward the bunkhouse without a word. Clara found herself lingering on the sight of him. She didn't know why, but something about his solitude called to her. In a world of noise and endless chatter, his silence seemed to hold more meaning than all the laughter combined. She shook herself then, turning back into the kitchen. Whatever his secrets were, they weren't hers to know. Her job was to cook, to keep the men fed, and to carve out a life for herself where once she had nothing. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that the quietest man on the ranch was the one she would one day come to understand most of all. Clara had just gotten comfortable in her new routine when trouble found its way to the ranch. It began with the pantry shelves. One morning, as she reached for the flour barrel, her hand scraped the bottom sooner than expected. The sugar sack was nothing but a fold of cloth with a few stubborn grains clinging inside. The coffee tin rattled nearly empty. She frowned, pulling everything forward for a better look. The beans were gone. The lard was almost gone. Even the salt pork was trimmed down to a few thin strips. Her heart sank. Cowboys could work without many things, but not without food. A hungry ranch hand was a dangerous combination. Tempers short, strength diminished, patience gone. If she couldn't put a meal on the table, her hard-earned respect would crumble overnight. When Harris, the foreman, came in to pour himself a cup of coffee, Clara spoke up. "Mr. Harris, the supplies won't last another day." He took a slow sip, then nodded. "I figured we were running low. Been meaning to send a wagon into town. Guess that time's now." Relief flickered across her face until he added, "You best come along, Miss Clara. You'll know what we need better than any of us." Clara's stomach twisted. She hadn't been back into town since taking the job. Part of her dreaded the stares, the whispers about the widow who wandered from one place to another. But Harris was right. If she left it to the men, they'd return with barrels of tobacco and maybe half a sack of beans. "Yes," she said at last, steeling herself. "I'll come." By mid-morning, the wagon was loaded with hides to trade, and a small crew of cowboys climbed aboard. Clara found herself seated between two of them on the rough wooden bench. The horses lurched forward, and the wheels creaked into rhythm. The men filled the ride with talk, swapping stories about broncos they'd broken and trails they'd ridden. They laughed loud and teased each other freely, but Clara noticed how their tone softened when speaking to her. They didn't cuss as much. They didn't tell the bawdiest jokes. Their rough edges dulled, as though the presence of a woman reminded them of some gentler piece of home they'd nearly forgotten. She smiled politely at their stories, but her attention kept drifting. Riding alongside, slightly apart from the wagon, was the quiet cowboy. He didn't join the laughter, didn't even glance at her. He kept his hat brim low and his horse at an easy pace, eyes scanning the horizon as though searching for something the others ignored. Clara couldn't tell if his silence was shyness or something else, something heavier. The trip stretched longer than expected. At a narrow bend along the trail, the wagon lurched suddenly, one wheel catching in a rut. Clara grabbed the bench to steady herself, heart pounding. The men cursed, leaping down to pry the wheel free. Dust billowed, horses snorted nervously. Before panic could spread, the quiet cowboy rode forward. He dismounted in one smooth motion, his voice low but steady. "Easy! Loosen the team! Rock the wheel!" The others, loud and fumbling, fell quiet under his calm direction. They obeyed without hesitation. Within moments, the wagon was free, the horses calmed, and the danger passed. Clara sat frozen on the bench, her hands trembling. It wasn't the near accident that shook her, but the way he had handled it. With authority so natural, so sure, it silenced the rowdiest of men. She watched him remount his horse, dust brushing from his gloved hands. He said nothing more, only nodded once to Harris before riding ahead. Clara's chest tightened with unspoken questions. Who was this man who could command with a whisper, yet live like a shadow among his own crew? By the time they reached town, the sun was high and the men scattered toward the saloon and supply stores. Clara went straight to the mercantile, a scrap of paper in hand with her list: flour, beans, sugar, coffee, lard, molasses, salt, pepper. She moved with quiet efficiency, ignoring the curious glances of townsfolk. Still, she heard the murmurs. That's the widow, the one working out at Miller's place now. As the storekeeper weighed out her flour, Clara caught a snatch of conversation near the counter. Two men leaned in, speaking low. "Funny thing, isn't it?" one said. "Everyone thinks Harris runs that ranch. But I heard tell the deeds in another man's name. Keeps himself quiet, don't like folks knowing." Clara's hand froze on the counter. The words pricked at her like a needle. She glanced over, but the men clammed up, noticing her listening. She forced a polite smile, took her sack of flour, and turned away. But the seed of curiosity was planted. If Harris wasn't the true owner, then who was? Her thoughts flickered. To the man who had freed the wagon with such quiet authority, the man who kept to himself and yet seemed to see everything. On the long ride home, Clara sat silently, the noise of the men's chatter fading into the background. She couldn't stop replaying the whispers, nor the image of the quiet cowboy stepping forward, calm as stone, while everyone else stumbled. For the first time since she arrived, Clara wondered if she really understood the ranch, or the men who lived upon it. The wagon creaked back into the ranch yard just as the sun dipped low, staining the horizon with red and gold. Clara's muscles ached from the long ride, but her mind was restless, stirred by the words she'd overheard in town. Everyone thinks Harris runs the ranch, but the deed belongs to another man. She tried to shake it off as idle gossip. Small towns thrived on rumors: who was courting who, whose cattle went missing, whose fence line needed fixing. Still, the way the men had spoken, low, cautious, as though speaking of someone who preferred to be unseen, stuck with her. The ranch looked the same as ever when they returned: cattle lowing in the pastures, horses stamping in the corral, cowboys laughing as they carried supplies inside. Nothing seemed extraordinary, yet Clara felt as though a curtain had been lifted just slightly, hinting at something hidden beneath the ordinary. Inside the kitchen, she unpacked the staples she'd bought: flour, beans, salt, sugar, familiar, comforts, steady and grounding. The rhythm of cooking steadied her hands, but her thoughts wandered restlessly. If Harris wasn't the owner, then who was? He acted the part, gave orders, handled disputes, kept discipline. But what if all of that was a show, a mask for the true master of the ranch? Her mind kept circling back to the quiet cowboy. He had been the one to take charge on the road without raising his voice, the one the men listened to without question. She remembered the way he'd dismounted, calm as stone, his words few but certain. No bluster, no boasting, just certainty. Could it be him? Could that man, who kept to the shadows of the porch and slipped in and out of the dining hall with barely a word, truly hold the deed to so much land? Clara tried to dismiss the thought. He dressed no finer than the others. His boots were scuffed, his hat worn, his shirt plain. If he had wealth or ownership, he hid it well. And why would a man with power choose to live as though he were just another hand? Still, the whispers clung to her, troubling her like burrs caught in a hem. That evening, supper was lively. The Cowboys, back from town and full of ale and boasting, crowded around the long table, laughter shaking the rafters. Clara moved among them, setting down dishes of roast beef, beans, and hot bread. She smiled when they complimented her cooking. But her mind was elsewhere, searching faces, weighing possibilities. At the end of the table sat the quiet cowboy, as always. He ate slowly, methodically, his expression calm. He never demanded her attention, never teased like the others, yet she couldn't keep herself from glancing his way, as though he might, without words, give her the answer to the question burning in her mind. When the meal ended, the men pushed back their chairs and filed out, leaving behind empty plates and the echo of their laughter. Clara stayed behind to clear the table, stacking dishes into neat piles. As she turned toward the kitchen, she caught movement out of the corner of her eye. The quiet cowboy had lingered. He stood at the edge of the room, hat in hand, as though debating whether to speak. Clara's heart skipped. She froze, dish in hand, waiting. But after a moment, he only gave a brief nod, his gaze steady, before slipping silently out the door. Clara exhaled, her pulse racing. That nod, it wasn't much, yet it felt deliberate, like acknowledgement. Respect, maybe, or something more. Later, as she scrubbed the last pan, Harris appeared in the doorway. "You done good today," he said, voice gruff but kind. "Supplies'll last us through Roundup, thanks to you." Clara wiped her hands on her apron. "Mr. Harris, may I ask you something?" He raised an eyebrow. "Go on." "Back in Quietest town, I heard talk. Folks said you don't own this place, that someone else does." Harris studied her for a long moment, then chuckled low. "Town gossips'll talk about anything, Miss Clara. Don't pay it no mind." But she saw the way his jaw tightened, the flicker in his eyes. He wasn't denying it. He was sidestepping. She nodded politely, pretending to accept his words, but inside her curiosity burned hotter. Harris had confirmed more with what he hadn't said than if he'd given her a straight answer. That night, lying awake in her small room, Clara turned the matter over and over. The ranch had a secret, and it wasn't Harris's to tell. Which meant someone else, someone close, was carrying it. And if her instincts were right, that someone was the quiet man whose silence spoke louder than any cowboy's laughter. Autumn rolled in fast across the plains, the kind of season that carried sharp winds and sudden storms. Clara had grown used to the rhythm of ranch life by now, early mornings, endless cooking, the cowboy's rough jokes, and the quiet weight of the man who never seemed far from her thoughts. But nothing had prepared her for the storm that struck one late afternoon, sweeping down from the mountains without warning. The day had begun bright, with clear skies and the men out on the range. Clara had spent her hours in the kitchen baking, pies, the scent of apple and cinnamon filling the air. She was just setting them on the sill to cool when the first rumble of thunder rolled low and long like a wagon crossing stone. She stepped to the door, shading her eyes against the sudden darkening sky. What she saw made her heart seize. Clouds, thick and heavy, tumbled across the horizon, swallowing the light in bruised purples and gray. A wall of rain swept toward the ranch, driven by wind that bent the tall grasses nearly flat. The first fat drops struck the porch roof as the cowboys rode in at full gallop, shouting to one another above the rising howl of the wind. Horses snorted and stamped as the men herded them into the barn, lightning flashing white against the black sky. Clara's pulse raced as she hurried to gather what she could: extra blankets, lanterns, and water pails. "Inside!" Harris bellowed, as the men dashed from barn to bunkhouse. "Everyone inside!" Clara barely made it through the kitchen door before the storm broke in full. Rain lashed the windows in sheets, the roof groaned under the force of the wind, and thunder cracked, so close it rattled the dishes on the shelves. She lit the lanterns, their glow fighting back the darkness, and listened as the men crowded into the bunkhouse dining room. The noise of the storm swallowed their voices at first, but gradually Clara realized the Cowboys were looking to Harris, waiting for him to steady them. Yet it wasn't Harris who spoke. It was the quiet cowboy. His voice cut through the roar, not loud, but calm, firm. "Check the windows, keep the doors barred, put weight against the shutters." The men moved. At once, no hesitation. Clara watched in astonishment as the loudest of them obeyed without question, bracing wood against the rattling shutters, setting their shoulders to keep the wind from tearing the door wide. The quiet man continued, giving orders with the same sure tone he'd used when freeing the wagon weeks ago. Lanterns spaced apart. "If one goes out, we'll still have light. Keep the fire stoked, not too high. Don't waste the wood. Harris, take the south wall. I'll check the roof." "You'll break your neck if you try it in this gale," Harris snapped, but the quiet man only gave a small nod and moved with purpose. In the chaos, he seemed carved from stone, unshaken, steady, and certain. Clara found herself gripping the edge of the table, her fear easing each time his voice sounded. She busied herself by passing out blankets, pouring strong coffee, and keeping the fire steady. But her eyes kept straying to him. When the shutters burst open with a crash, it was he who reached them first, slamming them shut against the screaming wind, his broad frame shielding the others until the latch held fast. Hours passed in that storm, the ranch shuddering under nature's fury. Yet within the bunkhouse, a strange calm took root. The men trusted him, trusted his silence, his judgment, his steady hand, and their panic dulled into focus. Clara marveled at it. Harris might have been the foreman, but in this moment it was clear who truly held their respect. At last, near midnight, the storm began to ease. The rain softened, thunder rolled farther and farther away, and the wind fell into tired gusts. The Cowboys slumped where they sat, exhaustion taking them like children after a hard day's play. Clara, weary but still awake, found herself near the fire, with the quiet cowboy standing a few paces away. His shirt was soaked through, his hair dark with rain, but his posture remained straight, his eyes steady on the dwindling flames. For the first time, she allowed herself to study him without looking away. His face was weathered, not young but strong, and there was a gravity about him that spoke of burdens carried long and alone. He caught her gaze then, not sharply, but gently, as though he'd been aware of her watching all along. Their eyes held for a long moment, silence passing between them like something understood. Then he gave a small nod, the same kind she had seen before, and turned back to the fire. Clara's heart stirred with something she couldn't name. In the storm, he had revealed himself, not just a cowboy, not just a man who kept to himself, but someone who held authority deeper than titles. Someone who commanded not with noise, but with the kind of strength that steadied others. She knew then, with a certainty that unsettled her, that the whispers she'd overheard in town had not been idle gossip. Whoever truly owned the ranch, it wasn't Harris. And in her heart, Clara began to believe it was the quietest man among them. The morning after the storm, the ranch looked as though a giant hand had swept across it in anger. Branches littered the ground, the fences sagged where the wind had forced them down, and the earth glistened with deep puddles. The Cowboys moved slowly, tired but alive, muttering thanks that no one had been hurt. Clara set to work in the kitchen, Brewing strong coffee and frying potatoes for a breakfast meant to put strength back in their bones. She worked quietly, her mind restless. The image of the quiet cowboy commanding the men through the storm lingered in her thoughts. He had not raised his voice once, yet every order had been followed without question. That kind of respect wasn't given to just anyone. When the men filed in for their meal, she noticed the way they glanced at him, not at Harris, the foreman, but at the quiet man, as though waiting for his approval before sitting down to eat. He gave a single nod, and the tension seemed to ease. Clara tried to hide her curiosity, but it only grew heavier on her heart. Later that afternoon, after the dishes were washed and the men had gone back to their work, Clara took the chance to step into the storage room where supplies were kept. She meant only to take inventory: flour, beans, coffee, the staples she'd need to request from town. But while rummaging through a drawer of old ledgers, she came across a folded packet of papers, tied with twine and marked with the ranch's name. Her hands hesitated. It wasn't her place to pry. And yet something about the storm, the whispers she had heard in town about the ranch's true owner, and the quiet man's strange authority pulled at her. Carefully, she untied the bundle and smoothed the top page. Open. Her breath caught. It was a deed, an official land title, weathered but clear, and stamped across the bottom in bold script was a name she recognized at once. Not Harris, not any of the rowdy cowboys. It was his name, the quiet man's, Clara's. Heart pounded as she read it twice, then a third time as though her eyes might have played tricks on her. But the truth was undeniable. He wasn't just another cowboy hired on like the rest. He was the owner. The land, the house, the cattle, all of it belonged to him. And he had been living among them as though he held nothing but his saddle and his silence. She folded the paper quickly, her fingers trembling, and slipped it back into its bundle. Questions swirled in her mind like the storm winds that had battered the ranch the night before. Why would he hide his ownership? Why let Harris act as foreman, barking orders while he worked alongside the hands like a common laborer? That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in gold and scarlet, Clara found herself walking toward the barn without quite knowing why. She found him there, repairing a broken hinge on the stable door. His sleeves were rolled up, his movements steady and unhurried, as if the storm had never touched him. She stood for a long moment before speaking, the deed's image still burning in her mind. "I found something today," she said softly. He looked up, surprise flickering in his eyes before settling into calm. "Oh?" She drew a breath. "Papers. A deed. With your name on it." For a heartbeat, silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the creak of the hinge under his hand. He set down his tools, wiped his palms on a rag, and straightened slowly. "I suppose I should have expected you'd come across it sooner or later," he said at last, his tone neither defensive nor ashamed. "Why?" Her voice came sharper than she intended. "Why let everyone believe Harris runs this place? Why pretend you're just another cowboy?" He met her eyes, his steady gaze holding hers without flinching. "Because respect earned as a man is worth more than fear earned as a boss. If they follow me, I want it to be because they trust me, not because they're bound to my title." Clara felt her anger dissolve into something softer, confusion, admiration, and something warmer she dared not name. He had hidden himself not out of pride, but humility. Not to deceive, but to live among his men as one of them. He stepped closer, then his voice gentler. "This ranch, it's land and cattle to most. To me, it's responsibility, and for a long time it felt like a weight I carried alone. But when you came, Clara—" He paused as though the words cost him something. "You made it feel like a home, not just for the men, for me." Clara's breath caught. The storm outside had passed, but a different storm stirred within her chest, one of realization, of seeing him not only as the quiet man who had steadied her fears, but as the true heart of the ranch. She looked at him then, really looked, and understood why he had chosen silence over boasting, humility over pride. And though she did not say it aloud, she knew her life had The evening air on the ranch carried a rare stillness after the chaos of the storm and Clara's discovery. The horizon blushed with fading colors, amber melting into deep blue, while the last sounds of the day drifted away, horses shifting in their stalls, cattle lowing in the far pasture, and the occasional laughter of the cowboys settling into their bunks. Inside the big house, the lamps flickered, and Clara found herself pacing the kitchen floor, her apron strings twisting in her hands. Her mind replayed the barn conversation over and over. His words had been quiet, but they echoed louder than any thunder. "You made it feel like a home." That confession had slipped past her guard, touching something she had carefully walled off for years, her heart. Clara had not thought herself the kind of woman who could matter so deeply to anyone, let alone to a man who owned the very land beneath her feet. Yet here she was, trembling not from fear, but from the strange weight of hope. When she could bear the silence no longer, she carried a pot of coffee outside. He was sitting on the porch steps, hat tilted low, gazing out over the darkened fields as if listening to the land breathe. She hesitated at the door, then drew in a steadying breath and stepped forward. "I thought you might want some," she said softly, holding out the steaming mug. He took it with a small nod, his fingers brushing hers. "Thank you, Clara." For a long while, neither spoke. The night sky stretched above them, vast and star-pricked, wrapping the world in its quiet cloak. Finally, Clara found her courage. "I need to understand. Why tell me at all? You could have kept the secret, let me keep thinking you were just another hand." He set the mug aside and folded his hands loosely, his posture calm, but his eyes carrying a weight that pulled at her. "Because you deserve the truth. You've given this place more than hot meals and clean dishes. You've given it laughter again. Warmth. I couldn't stand the thought of you feeling lied to." Her throat tightened. "You weren't lying. Not really. Just hiding." A faint smile tugged at his lips, but it held no mockery. "I've been hiding most of my life. Easier to let folks see me as the quiet one in the corner than as the man with everything on his shoulders." He paused, his gaze dropping to the ground as though he feared the next words. "But with you, Clara, I don't want to hide." The honesty in his voice struck her like sunlight breaking through clouds. She sat beside him, the wood of the porch step creaking beneath her weight. "You make it sound as if I've done something remarkable, when all I've done is cook for you." He turned to her then, his expression raw, his voice low. "You've done more than you'll ever know. Before you came, the ranch ran on grit and habit. The men worked because they were paid. I lived because I had to. But you—" He reached up, hesitated, then let his calloused fingers brush against hers. "You brought life back here, to them, to me." Clara's chest ached, her pulse quickening. She wanted to pull her hand away, yet she couldn't move. His touch was warm, grounding, and it carried a sincerity she had never known from any man before. "I never meant to be anything more than a cook," she whispered. "And I never meant to let someone into my heart again," he admitted, his voice trembling for the first time since she'd known him. "But here we are." The silence that followed was thick, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the beating of her heart, with the knowledge that this quiet cowboy, this landowner who had chosen humility over power, was offering her more than a place on his ranch. He was offering her his truth, his vulnerability, and perhaps his love. Clara swallowed hard, her eyes stinging. Do you know what I thought when I first arrived here? That I'd feed a group of rough men, keep my head down, and earn enough to get by? I never imagined. She faltered, her voice breaking. He leaned closer, his gaze steady on hers. Never imagined what? That someone would look at me the way you do, she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. His breath caught, and for the first time she saw his composure crack, replaced by a tenderness so deep it frightened her. He lifted her hand fully into his, holding it as though it were the most precious thing in his world. Clara, I've built fences, broken horses, survived drought and fire, but saying this to you, he drew a slow breath. It's the hardest thing I've ever done, because if you turn away, I don't know what I'll be left with. Her heart twisted at the vulnerability in his voice. This man, who owned thousands of acres and commanded respect without ever raising his voice, feared only one thing: losing her. Clara's lips parted, and for once she did not hold back the truth that had been growing in her chest since the day she stepped foot on the ranch. I'm not turning away, she whispered. Not from you. Relief flooded his features, softening every line. He didn't pull her into his arms, not yet. Instead, he held her hand more firmly, as if anchoring them both in that moment, letting the night bear witness to the confession that bound them together. For Clara, it was not the deed that mattered, nor the land, nor the title he bore in secret. It was the man himself, humble, steady, and true, who had confessed his heart to her under the wide, forgiving sky. Morning broke soft and golden across the ranch, painting the land in hues of promise. The storm had passed, the fences had been mended, and the cattle were calm again. But inside Clara's heart, something far deeper had shifted. The confession shared on the porch the night before lingered with her like the warmth of a hearth fire, steady, glowing, impossible to forget. She rose early, as always, preparing breakfast for the men. The Cowboys stumbled in one by one, rubbing their eyes, teasing each other, and filling the room with the noise and camaraderie that had become her daily rhythm. But Clara noticed something different in the way they looked at her now. Respect, yes, but also a certain gentleness, as though they'd sensed the change between her and the quiet man who had revealed himself as their true boss. When he entered the room, hat in hand, the chatter dimmed for a moment. The Cowboys glanced. Between the two of them, curious, though no words were spoken, he gave Clara a small nod, nothing more, but the weight of that glance settled in her chest like a promise. She returned it with a smile, subtle yet sure. After breakfast, when the men rode out to tend the herds, he lingered behind. The room felt suddenly too quiet, filled only with the clatter of her washing dishes. She didn't turn when he stepped, closer, but she could feel his presence as clearly as the sun warming her back. You work too hard, he said softly. She laughed under her breath. I wouldn't know what to do with myself if I stopped. You'd live, he replied. You'd rest. You'd let someone take care of you for once. That made her pause. She turned, drying her hands on her apron, and met his steady gaze. And who exactly would that someone be? His answer came without hesitation. Me. The single word dropped between them like a stone into still water, sending ripples through her soul. For years, Clara had carried her burdens alone, loss, fear, the endless search for belonging. And now here was this man, offering her not just a place to stay, but a place to rest, a life to share. She studied him, the quiet strength in his frame, the humility in his manner, and the honesty that had guided every word he'd spoken the night before. This wasn't a man who made promises lightly. If he said he would take care of her, he meant it with every fiber of his being, but Clara was no fragile bird, and she needed him to understand that. I don't want to be kept, she said gently. I want to stand beside someone, not behind them. I want a life built together, not one given as charity. A slow, warm smile curved his lips, the kind that transformed his entire face. Good, because I don't need someone to follow me. I need someone to walk with me. And Clara, that someone's you. Her breath caught, and she pressed a hand to her chest, overwhelmed by the simplicity and truth of it. Are you asking me to stay? I'm asking you to stay, he confirmed, stepping closer, his voice a low rumble filled with earnestness. Not as our cook, not as a hired hand, as mine, as my partner, my wife, if your heart can allow it. The word wife hung in the air, both terrifying and beautiful. Clara's eyes burned with tears she hadn't expected. She thought of the little girl she once was, dreaming of safety. She thought of the young woman who had lost everything, certain her story was over. And now, here stood this quiet, steady man, offering her not just a home, but a future written together. She lifted her chin, blinking back the tears, and smiled through them. Yes, she whispered, I'll stay. Relief and joy flickered across his face, though he didn't sweep her into an embrace like in the stories. Instead, he reached for her hand, lifting it gently to his lips in a gesture that spoke volumes. Respect, devotion, a promise. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the land in fire and gold, the Cowboys gathered on the porch, pretending not to notice the way their boss and their cook, no, their lady, stood side by side. Some grinned knowingly, others exchanged whispers, but no one dared jest too loudly. The ranch had changed, and they all knew it. For Clara, the kitchen no longer felt like a cage of duty, but the heart of a home. For him, the land no longer seemed a burden of solitude, but a place rich with belonging. Together, they had turned a house of men into something more, a family. And as the stars blinked awake overhead, Clara leaned into his shoulder, finally at peace. She had been hired as a cook, nothing more. But she had stayed as something far greater, a woman loved, a partner cherished, and the